In the early to mid-80s, Jason Voorhees dominated the horror box office. The mass slasher went from a jump scare at the end of the first movie to a pop culture icon in impressive fashion, enraging conservative parents while delighting teenagers who loved seeing him stalk and kill other teenagers on the big screen. Of the first 4 films, 3 of them made over $30 million at the US box office, an impressive feat for the time. However, starting around 1985, with the much criticized Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, the series' grosses started dwindling. Yes, they were still making money for Studio Paramount thanks to their low budgets, but the air was seemingly coming out of the franchise the longer that it went along. The low point, in many fans' opinion, was the release of Jason Takes Manhattan, a movie where the fans finally had to admit that Jason's machete blade had become quite dull. With a US gross of just $14 million, Jason Takes Manhattan signaled the death knell for the unkillable maniac. But you can't keep a good supernatural murderer down, not forever. Some 4 years later, Jason would be resurrected yet again, although this time in a very different manner. Hope you don't mind adding a little body snatching to your slasher movie formula, because we're going to find out what happened to Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday.
Jason Voorhees.
Well, that makes me think of a little girl in a pink dress, sticking a hot dog through a donut.
After the dismal performance of Jason Takes Manhattan at the box office, Paramount Pictures was ready to wash its hands of the Jason character. Eager to reunite with him was Sean Cunningham, the producer and director of the very first Friday the 13th. Cunningham had been in a rut at this point, career-wise, and saw a reunion with Jason to be a perfect way to jumpstart things. New Line Cinema, the house that Freddy built, acquired the rights to the Jason Voorhees character, with an eye towards tossing him into the ring with their own prized horror icon, Freddy Krueger. But rights complications, not to mention the lack of a usable screenplay, prevented that matchup from happening, at least temporarily. Before the two mutilated monsters could go head-to-head, Cunningham and New Line thought that it was the right time to bring Jason back from the dead in one last standalone story, returning him to where it all began, Camp Crystal Lake. Around this same time, a young NYU student named Adam Marcus was heading out to LA to pitch a screenplay that he and his classmate Dean Lorey had developed called Johnny Zombie, a horror comedy musical hybrid that Marcus had intended to direct. Marcus showed the script to Cunningham, whom he'd actually known since he was a child. Sean's son Noel was actually Adam's childhood friend, so Marcus knew the Friday the 13th franchise very well. Cunningham agreed to get Johnny Zombie produced, and the script was eventually purchased by none other than Disney, which went about toning down the horror, getting rid of the musical numbers, and almost getting rid of the zombies from the project altogether. The studio was certainly not going to entrust this movie to a 21-year-old newbie like Marcus, and he quickly found himself looking for a new job. He agreed to work as an assistant at Cunningham's company, Horror Inc., and ultimately proved to be so reliable that Cunningham agreed to let him come up with the concept for a new Friday the 13th flick. Meanwhile, Johnny Zombie, a shell of its former self, was eventually made and called My Boyfriend's Back. According to Marcus, Cunningham's only caveats on the new Friday film were that he had to get rid of the infamous hockey mask, and the movie should completely ignore the existence of Jason Takes Manhattan. The first one is something that Cunningham has refuted, saying that Marcus had the initial idea to bring the franchise in a completely new direction and ditch the Jason that everyone had known for 8 movies. Whatever the case, Marcus would come up with a radically different kind of Friday the 13th movie, and eventually get the green light. Marcus's concept involved the revelation that Jason was driven by a demonic heart. He referred to the character as Hell's Assassin. In fact, Jason was initially brought back to life by the Necronomicon from the Evil Dead movies. The book even makes an appearance in the finished film. In the original pitch, Jason is dragged out of Crystal Lake by his deformed brother Elias, who longs for Jason's immortality and powers. Elias eventually eats Jason's black heart and more or less becomes him, but his body is so frail that he's forced to possess the bodies of innocent bystanders, thus prolonging his existence. A wild concept to be sure, but apparently Cunningham and New Line both went for it. Marcus was paired with a veteran TV writer named Jay Hughley, once a consulting producer on Magnum PI. According to Marcus, the script took a year to develop, but all that work still didn't produce a coherent or usable screenplay. With the clock ticking on the film's pre-production, Marcus brought in his Johnny Zombie writer, Dean Lorey, to take a crack at the draft. Lorey allegedly only had 4 days to completely rework the script, which he did at Cunningham's office while the producer hovered over him every minute of the day. Lorey ditched the Elias character and brought Jason back into the fold, although the body-hopping concept stuck. Lorey wasn't crazy about that idea and actually pitched Jason Goes to LA, which would involve Jason taking on 2 warring gangs on the streets of Los Angeles. But because the body-hopping train had already left the station, Lorey had no choice but to finesse that idea as best as he could. The writer added a Quint-like character named Creighton Duke, who had supposedly been hunting Jason this whole time. Where he was during the first 8 movies is anyone's guess, but no matter. He also added a baby into the mix. This little one would be Jason's niece's child, and the apple of Jason's eye, an opportunity to be reborn, because his evil soul has to invade the body of a Voorhees in order to fully resurrect himself. Yes, there are more members of the Voorhees clan than we'd known about, and a lot of mythology was dredged up from scratch in an attempt to explain this new look for Jason. After only 4 days, Lorey delivered his draft to New Line executive Michael DeLuca. According to Lorey, DeLuca thought the script was pretty bad, but he gave it the green light anyway, perhaps figuring that the project was low risk, high reward. The budget was set at $2.5 million, so the movie wasn't going to be a huge gamble for the studio. Marcus, still very much unproven, had to shoot what's called a director's test for New Line to prove that he can handle the workload. He shot the sequence where our lead Steven fights with Deputy Randy, resulting in a John Woo-like standoff, and it impressed New Line's head honcho, Bob Shea, enough to let the 22-year-old helm the picture. The film is comprised mostly of working-class adults, another interesting change from the usual Friday formula. Initially, the lead was supposed to be Tommy Jarvis from parts 4, 5, and 6, but Marcus eventually found out that Paramount still owned the rights to that character, and thus he couldn't use him. The character was rewritten as Stephen Freeman, the unwitting father of the baby that Jason is attempting to possess. Adam wanted his brother Kip to play the lead, but the request was denied, so Kip ended up playing the part of Deputy Randy instead. For Steven, the production added something of a Friday the 13th alumni, John D. LeMay, known then for his role as Ryan Dallion in the Friday the 13th TV series. Though the TV show had nothing to do with Jason, it was made by the same producers, and an assistant director on the series recommended LeMay to Marcus, who ultimately cast him. LeMay had never seen a Friday the 13th movie in his life up until that point, though he eventually rented the original just to see what he was getting himself into. To play the bounty hunter Creighton Duke, Marcus went with Stephen Williams, best known for his role on 21 Jump Street. Tony Todd had even auditioned for the part, as did Richard Gant, who went on to play the possessed coroner in the first act of the film. But Williams' sense of fun won him the part. Williams wanted to outfit the character himself, giving Duke some cowboy attire. The actor later admitted that he didn't know what the hell Duke was talking about half the time, since most of his dialogue is convoluted exposition, but he still did the best that he could to make the character as charismatic as possible. To play Jason's surprise sister, another TV veteran was hired, Erin Gray, best known for a role in the Buck Rogers in the 25th Century series. Gray enjoyed the experience of making Jason Goes to Hell, but was rather dismayed when she saw the sequence towards the end of the movie, where the spirit of Jason crawls inside her dead body in a most distasteful way. Gray only saw this sequence for the first time during the premiere, and later said that she felt violated by the ugly scene. Playing Jason's niece was Carrie Keegan, who only auditioned for the part because another actress at her agency couldn't make it. Her agents didn't think she was Friday the 13th material, but Sean Cunningham liked her immensely and made sure director Adam Marcus cast her in the role, as opposed to Marcus's preferred choice, his friend Laurie Holden, who would later go on to star in The Walking Dead. Keegan might have later regretted getting the part, however. One story from the set is that Marcus wanted her to bear it all during the character's emotional shower scene, although Keegan had already made it clear that she was not going to be doing any nudity. The director and actress apparently had a falling out over the matter, leading Cunningham to intervene. Some reports contend that Cunningham had to direct the shower scene after Keegan refused to do it with Marcus at the helm. The only holdover from past Friday the 13th films was Kane Hodder, of course the man who played Jason in parts 7 and 8. Though he would not be in the movie as Jason a whole lot, Hodder was game to strap on Jason's new grotesque makeup, designed by those great monster makers at K&B Effects. The only issue with the new costume was that Kane couldn't remove the head in between takes, so it was quite difficult for the actor to catch his breath after an arduous sequence. Hodder got to have some extra fun as a SWAT team member who calls Jason a nasty word before he's killed by the resurrected killer early in the film.
You want nothing but a big old pussy anyway.
Adam Marcus and his effects team were allowed to go crazy with the blood and guts stuff because New Line told him that they'd be releasing an unrated director's cut on home video, one of the very first times the studio had planned ahead for such a release. This led to the film having perhaps the most graphic killings of any Friday the 13th movie. Up until that point anyway. While the movie has several memorable moments of gore, a few other intriguing sequences stand out. And yes, we're talking about the homoerotic moments between Duke and Steven. And even between Jason and a deputy he feels compelled to shave before, impregnating? The reasons for these scenes are twofold, according to Marcus at least. He knew the homoerotic undertones would make the audience squirm, particularly the men. He reasoned that the violent scenes wouldn't make them uncomfortable, but these odd interactions that felt completely out of place in a Jason movie almost certainly would. Secondly, Marcus joked that the reason he put the shaving scene in the movie is because people would still be talking about it 30 years later, and on that score we can't disagree. One moment that no one would disapprove of would be the film's final shot, which depicts Freddy's glove dragging Jason's mask down to hell with him. Marcus claims it was his idea to put this in the film, and since New Line was envisioning making a Freddy vs. Jason film down the line, the scene made sense. It's actually Kane Hodder's hand that dons the glove, although the stuntman would never actually get to match his Jason against Robert Englund's Freddy.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Originally, Marcus wanted an entire sequence of Jason writhing in hell to be included, but that idea was quickly squashed by Cunningham, who knew that it would be way too costly. Post-production was apparently an uneasy process. There are plenty of indications that Sean Cunningham was displeased with the footage that he was receiving, prompting him to take the reins and reshoot several sequences, eventually taking control of the edit altogether. The producer complained about many of the director's stylistic flourishes, demeaning them by labeling them too film school. The movie's 2-hour runtime was whittled down to about 89 minutes, with much character development cut out. While it's unclear exactly what happened between the two, the relationship between Cunningham and Marcus had soured. Though, to his credit, Marcus is still grateful that the producer took a chance on a 20-something with no feature directing experience. Test screenings were mixed, with audiences not quite sure what to make of this surreal new take on the Jason Voorhees character. One thing many of them agreed on was that there needed to be a scene where Jason actually killed some campers. You know, the thing he's most famous for doing. So the production did some reshoots and added the sequence where Steven drops off 3 horny youngsters at the camp, where they're subsequently slaughtered. It's worth noting that this scene has one of the most memorable deaths in the entire franchise, when one of the young ladies finds herself split right up the middle, an effect that required 2 separate body casts of the actress. Other reshoots involve Creighton Duke explaining the Jason curse to Steven in jail. If you look closely, you can even see the length of Steven Williams' facial hair change in between shots. The MPAA, unsurprisingly, was not kind to the film when they received it. They'd long made it a point to single out the Friday the 13th franchise for its wanton violence, and Jason Goes to Hell would be no exception. In fact, according to Marcus, the MPAA didn't even finish the movie the first time they sat down with it. So appalled were they by what they were seeing. They didn't want to just give it an X rating. They didn't want to give it anything at all. The filmmakers had to figure out what to cut out before even getting notes from the organization. An unenviable task that nonetheless eventually led to an R rating. Thankfully, the unrated version was the cut of the film that most countries outside of the US got to experience in the theater. Jason Goes to Hell was released on August 13, 1993, fittingly, 13 years after the release of the original film. Ironically, Cunningham's other movie developed with Adam Marcus and Dean Lorey, My Boyfriend's Back, came out a week earlier, meaning they were competing with themselves in a way. The Final Friday debuted with a respectable $7.5 million. But the good news would stop there, as it ultimately went on to make only $15 million, a blip better than the gross of Jason Takes Manhattan 4 years earlier. Critics were harsh, naturally, but horror fans were both confused and angered by the bizarre direction that Marcus took their beloved Jason on. The unrated cut released on VHS helped appease some of the gorehounds, and once time had passed, the film became something of a cult classic. Maybe not here, but somewhere. Jason Goes to Hell is still debated about to this day. Some fans who were put off by its tenuous connection to the other Fridays have since forgiven it, and recognize that it's a unique, gory, and self-aware popcorn flick that works on its own merits. Call it the Halloween 3 effect. Still, others will never get over how Jason Goes to Hell trampled all over the legacy of its predecessors and struck out on its own. To those people, Marcus often reassures them that there are still several Friday movies where you can see Jason do his thing in the traditional way, if that's what you want. For what it's worth, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, is a bit like Jason himself, ungainly, immune to common sense, and very much in a class of its own. Space. While it's often joked as the place that horror franchises go to die, yet one series took it in stride. No, I'm not talking about Critters 4, or Leprechaun 4, or Hellraiser 4. And sure, some people view this as the black sheep of the series, but I'd reserve that space for a certain buttworm Jason. So bust out your nipple clamps, cause we're seeing just how awfully good is Jason X. A sign of a great movie is one that has to sit on the shelf for years, waiting to be released, right? Well, despite the fact that this was written off as a joke for so many years, Jason X has found a pretty passionate fan base, and I count myself amongst them. I find this movie to be infinitely rewatchable and so entertaining during its entire runtime. Because while I love the franchise, they're often pretty interchangeable, and many of my friends have trouble differentiating between them. But everyone knows the space one. Its identity is so clearly defined. The basic premise of the movie is absurdly simple. Jason goes to space. I could pretty much leave it at that, but just know that there's also a group of students on this massive spaceship, and a full-blown SWAT team. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it doesn't have to. It's all about upping that sweet, sweet body count. The credit sequences in these films usually aren't much to write home about, often being just white text on a black screen. Yet here we have a journey through hell as we get to see a close-up of Jason's insides. It's full of some genuinely fantastic visuals, and almost sets up the movie to be much grander in scale than it ends up being. Because once we leave the credits and get firmly into space, holy hell. If you've never seen Canadian sci-fi television, then let me introduce you to the Stargate SG-1s and Andromedas of the world. Because there are times where I'm not sure if I'm watching a Friday the 13th sequel or something that belongs on the Sci-Fi Channel. It doesn't help that two of the main leads from the film, Lexa Doig and Lisa Ryder, also starred on Andromeda. Ryder is even this insane cyborg that fights Jason one-on-one. This movie just reeks of absurd sci-fi shit. I feel like when it comes to Jason X, there are three important aspects to talk about: the head freeze, Uber Jason, and the virtual reality.
You want a beer?
Or do you want to smoke some pot?
Or we can have premarital sex.
The virtual reality featured in this movie is every gamer's wet dream. This thing is fully immersive and even capable of tricking its users. Though I'm not sure why some people need rigs, while Jason can just walk right in and see everything. But we'll ignore that. And we'll also ignore the fact that Jason kills these two dudes in much more satisfying ways in the VR setup than in actual reality. I mean, heck, he just breaks this dude's back and slams Dallas's head up against the wall. But the real showcase for the VR is the scene that mimics Camp Crystal Lake. It gives you that little taste of Friday the 13th that we all know and love. And we even get a nice little homage to the sleeping bag kill from part 7. Even if you'd never seen the movie before, there's a good chance you'd seen this kill. Because the sheer idea of Jason freezing someone's head in liquid nitrogen is already great. But then the little extra something that Kane gives the body makes it even more hilarious. What's even better about this is that they shoot back and forth between Jason's revival and this scene, which further proves that Jason is fueled by teen debauchery. And while Jason was known for his violent tendencies, the series was often neutered by the ratings board. So to see something so in your face was a nice change of pace. And this was due to the changing landscape of cinema. The film actually had the least amount of issues with the MPAA. Somewhat surprising given how gory the film can get at times. But hey, I'm not complaining. If anything, the gorier the better.
I'd say it got better. It's been modified. Oh, you think?
Uber Jason is one of the more insane things that the series has ever done, and that's saying quite a lot. Did I mention the buttworm? Yet even still, I never had nanobots turning Jason into some souped up super shredder on my Friday the 13th bingo card. And while he looks absolutely ridiculous, complete with what looks like full-blown shoulder pads, there's nothing about this design that works. Okay, those eyes are pretty cool, but it's how bad it is that just makes it all the more endearing. I mean, look at the size of his arm. And that mask looks like it's made of cheap plastic. He could practically be a Power Rangers villain. But the fine details of the costume are great to look out for and accomplishes its job of creating an even more powerful Jason, even if it looks silly as shit.
What do we do when you find this guy?
Well, I promised the doc we'd take him alive. So, after you blow him all to hell, put one in his leg so we can say we tried.
Alright, I know I said 3, but f it. The fourth aspect about this movie that makes it stand out is Sergeant Brodsky. Played by Peter Mensah, this guy is an absolute badass. I mean, just watch as Jason supposedly kills him.
It's gonna take more than a poke in the ribs to put down this old dog.
Yeah, that ought to do it.
But that's not enough to keep old Brodsky down, and he shows up to stab Jason in the arm here. And he even gets patched up by the old nanobites that helped out Jason. And this guy doesn't rest on his laurels at any point, taking Jason head on while the damn ship is blowing up. And when that doesn't work, he takes Jason down to Earth, sacrificing himself as they burn up re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Screenwriter Todd Farmer appears in the role of Dallas, poking fun at the character from the first Alien. Early on, James Isaac pitched a winter set Crystal Lake tale, but New Line rejected it, wanting to avoid having the slasher back in the woods. Despite its digital look, the movie was actually shot on 35mm film. Jason never blinks anytime his eyes are shown. Famed director David Cronenberg appears in the beginning of the film. Louis Abernathy, you know, the bearded guy from Titanic, actually did a pass on the script, adding humor to the dialogue. Had the largest budget of the franchise so far with $14 million. The highest body count of the series with 25 kills. Kane Hodder's final appearance in the series as Jason. Until the video game, that is. Mythbusters determined that it is possible for someone's head to shatter after being dipped into liquid nitrogen. There's a lot to love about Jason X, even with all of its terrible qualities. So on a scale from Victor Salva to Roger Corman, this one gets a strong 9 out of 10. because no matter how much space is considered a death nail, if anything, this series proves that it's just another avenue for fun violence. What else would you like to see us cover on Awfully Good? Let us know in the comments and we'll leave you with these words of wisdom.
I don't think he's out there.
Why don't you just stick your head out and have a peek?
Often the debate can be had regarding whether or not the audience cares about the victims in a horror film or the killer themselves. And it can be even more polarizing when it comes to slashers. Sure, we all love the Laurie Strodes and Nancy Thompsons of the world, but what about this guy? Or this girl? In those instances, we are firmly on the side of the killer. So in 2003, when two titans of the horror genre did battle, you can sure as hell bet that there was no one buying a ticket to root on Miss Laurie Campbell. I'm Tyler Nichols with JoBlo Horror, and today on Real Slashers, we're taking a look at Freddy vs. Jason.
Make them remember what fear tastes like!
I've been away from my children for far too long.
I'm going to state right from the jump that this is infinitely more of an Elm Street film than a Friday the 13th film. The aesthetics align more with Elm Street, and Freddy is quite literally using Jason as a way to spread his name. As he often is, Freddy is the puppet master in this situation, so it makes sense for the story to feel more on the nightmare side of things. But I do feel like it needs to be mentioned because I think it's a fair criticism from Friday fans wanting equal representation.
It's time to put this bad dog to sleep. For good!
The story of Freddy vs. Jason is actually pretty fun, with Freddy using Jason to start murdering kids on Elm Street. See, the town of Springwood has done its best to erase the Krueger name, and therefore cut off Freddy's supply of victims. But Jason doesn't like being controlled, and the two eventually square off in a bloody battle. This was one of the most popular horror films of the 2000s, so I'm not going to bore you by slowly moving through the plot. Let's focus on the slasheriness and the Jason and Freddy of it all. As a slasher, Freddy vs. Jason delivers the goods in terms of kills. While I'd argue that there are only a couple that stand out, the ones that do leave a pretty decent impression. Unfortunately, while the film does have a large body count, a lot of that comes from the corn maze scene, which is mostly just Jason slashing characters that we don't even know. One element that I always love about a Friday the 13th is the quick succession of kills that happen as the film enters its third act. Everyone who's not a final boy or girl is dying one scene after another. They obviously couldn't do that here, and I think it's one of the many ways that it plays out more like a nightmare film. These characters are being traumatized and then killed, and then there's always some kind of immediate reaction to their death. And the deaths are pretty decently spaced out. Maybe the corn maze was their way of doing a Friday the 13th style scene, but even then, killing in front of a bunch of people isn't exactly Jason's style. He stalks until he can't stalk no mo'. Just one of many instances of the filmmakers not fully understanding the Jason Voorhees character. And I just have to bring up something about this movie that has always bugged me. Kelly Rowland falls asleep as she waits for Laurie to wake up. Freddy messes with her in the dream and does a fun little
Got your nose!
He then proceeds to pull off her nose, but then when she wakes in the real world, her nose is still there. How? Going back to even the first Elm Street film, anything that happens in the dream will then translate over into the real world. And don't even tell me, it's because he's not powerful enough yet. Because we already saw when Freddy tries to kill Blake that his lack of power translates to the dream as well, since the blades dissipate upon contact. So this makes absolutely no sense. But I guess it's a cool visual. The final 20 minutes of Freddy vs. Jason is absolutely brilliant.
Sweet, dark meat.
Okay, fine. It was 2003 and they made some dumb dialogue choices. But the action itself between the two killers is next level. The amount of blood that these two spill from each other would be comical if it weren't these two characters at the forefront. Just by virtue of these two having such high body counts themselves, anything less than an Olympic pool volume of blood just wouldn't have been enough. You'll notice I didn't really focus on any of the human characters, and that's because they all kind of suck. Laurie's our final girl, and she hardly even feels worthy of the title. let alone being someone that bested two of the greatest killers of all time. But like I said in the beginning, we press play for Voorhees and Krueger, not Laurie Campbell.
You're the one that killed Jay!
Oh, don't worry about my little Aaron, boy. The only thing to fear is fear himself.
Both Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees get quite the introduction here. Freddy narrates a whole section that summarizes much of the Elm Street timeline, complete with his many deaths. Unfortunately, New Line didn't have the rights to the Paramount era of Friday the 13th, so they weren't able to do a sweet montage in the same vein. They instead opted to show a brand new kill of Jason's. This does a decent job at setting up both of the behemoths for those that haven't had a ton of experience with them. Jason is big and brutish and likes to kill people in the woods. And Freddy likes to mess with teens in their dreams before killing them. And he also has a tendency to get murdered by a cute girl. We get a side of both characters that we hadn't quite gotten to this point in either of their respective series. First, there's Freddy in his demon form, clearly speaking to the viewer from hell. His makeup is different and there's a ferociousness to it. We get another look that's a little more intense later on in the film when Freddy's about to kill Gib and as he jumps out of the lake after Laurie. Clearly, this is his pissed off mode. Then when we see Jason, we get to see the full reanimation, with his lungs filling with air as Freddy's Pamela Voorhees yells commands at him. This immediately solidifies that Jason is motivated by misbehaving young adults. But a lot of his behavior in this film feels more like Michael Myers than Jason Voorhees, with him stalking the suburbs versus a camp. I don't have an issue with Ken Kersinger's version of Jason, but I do wish that we were able to see Kane Hodder in the role. There's a meanness that just isn't present here. Sure, Jason is tall and imposing, but that's about it. I don't hate his look, though it's a shame that the hockey mask is missing the trademark chunk taken out of it. Yet another reason that this doesn't feel like my Jason. But oh well. Freddy, on the other hand, is utterly perfect. Robert Englund's final time as Freddy is absolutely scene-stealing. He has such a command of a room when he puts on that makeup that his absence from cinema over the past 20+ years has been sorely missed. This is some of the best Freddy makeup out there as well, being a perfect blend of pretty much every iteration that we've seen before. A red and green sweater, burnt skin, a dirty fedora, and a razor glove. Absolute perfection.
You are like a big super dog who can't stop eating! Even though your master said you've had enough!
What better scene to slice up than Freddy and Jason meeting for the first time? Okay, technically Freddy and Jason meet at the very beginning of the film, but Freddy's in Pam drag, so I'm not counting it. Instead, their first true meeting is after Freddy injects Voorhees with a ton of tranquilizer. Ah, poor Freeberg. The scene has a great red aura to it that firmly puts this in Freddy's world. I really appreciate the use of red for Freddy and the use of green for Jason, even if it gives it an unintentional Christmas vibe. Freddy has always been a jokester, so I appreciate that he is immediately fucking with Jason, even making him think that he cut off his arms. There's a bit of a Looney Tunes quality about how they fight each other. The entire scene is shot like some kind of Hong Kong action film, complete with speed ramps and following Jason's machete as it soars through the air. There's an energy and fantastical side present that helps to separate it from their big fight later on. Freddy playing pinball with Jason's body wouldn't have worked so well had they not utilized this extreme lighting. It does a good job of hiding some of the issues that would have been there with the CGI. The worst part about this scene, and hell, the entire movie, is the dumb inclusion of Jason being afraid of water. We've seen Jason in water throughout the Friday the 13th franchise, so it's incredibly stupid to suddenly put this stipulation on the character. Hell, he's in water later on, so clearly this isn't some deep-set fear of his. Hell, Freddy's been tormenting him about his mother the whole movie. The answer of Jason's fear is right there. The loss of his mother and need for vengeance. There's even more that they don't seem to understand about the Jason character, because they show him being bullied by other campers. Since when is that canon? Last I knew, Pamela Voorhees set it up pretty well in the first film. The counselors weren't paying attention and Jason drowned. Heck, you'd think that if Jason were bullied as a youth, he'd probably also kill kids that are around the same age. Yet, anytime Jason is given the opportunity, he doesn't. Just stupid writing. The scene ends with Jason hilariously wireworking his way out of the van and Freddy entering his demon form. Seriously, so much is happening here.
I pulled that out of my dream.
How is that possible? Anything is possible now. God, you just don't get it.
God, y'all two killers, we're not safe awake or asleep.
Freddy vs. Jason released in the United States on August 15, 2003, and managed to bring in $36.4 million on its opening weekend. The film would end its worldwide run at over $116 million, making it the most successful film for either franchise to that point. While the Freddy vs. Jason Rotten Tomatoes score is absolutely ludicrous, I do quite enjoy their critics' consensus, as I feel it's right on the nose. Fans of the two horror franchises will enjoy this showdown, but for everyone else, it's the same old slice and dice. Sure, the film doesn't break any new ground and isn't likely to bring in any new fans, but what it does do is provide a satisfying clash of two horror titans. It's no easy task to bring these two worlds together, and writers Damian Shannon and Mark Swift do a great job of melding them. And I know that they hate the Jason hates water thing too, so maybe let's stop putting the blame on them. I promise you, most of the things that you don't like about this movie are because of this guy. But you know who's also responsible for a lot of the fun in this movie? Also this guy. Filmmaking is complicated. The climax being so open-ended was a brilliant decision, as it allowed there to be debate amongst audiences. Jason may have risen out of the lake holding Freddy's head, but Freddy winked, showing that he's still alive. He could technically start the process all over again. So if you're a Jason fan, you'll likely think that Jason won. And if you're a Freddy fan, you'll likely think that Freddy won. And that's the fun of it. I personally have viewed it like I do most of these films, that these characters are destined to do this forever. Though with there being 14 and 15 years respectively since we've seen these characters in the movie theater, I'm starting to wonder if we'll ever get these two back on screen together again. We of course got two different comic arcs that would also include Bruce Campbell's Ash Williams, but otherwise there hasn't ever been a proper follow-up. At this point, I'd say the door is closed on another entry. But if producers are somehow able to build Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees back up to the heights that they were once at, we may see them pitted against each other again. Everyone remembers the state of horror in the 2000s, right? After Texas Chainsaw Massacre scared audiences everywhere, Hollywood grew obsessed with remaking classic horror films. And not only that, they were given a gritty edge. Amityville Horror, Halloween, even The Hitcher were subject to this trend. The quality varied through the years, yet there never seemed to be signs of slowing down. And the production company who started it all, Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, refused to slow down, targeting every possible franchise that they could get their hands on. And there was a certain hockey mask-wearing psychopath who had been on ice since his battle with the man of your dreams. So they packed their bags of blood and hillbilly characters and got ready for an extended stay at Crystal Lake. Bringing back Jason is no easy task, so let's see what the happened to the Friday the 13th remake.
Apparently there was one survivor. This girl, she cut that lady's head off with a machete.
The idea of rebooting the Friday the 13th series actually came from New Line Cinema head Toby Emmerich. He went to Platinum Dunes to see if they'd be interested in rebooting the series. They of course were, and entered a year-long negotiation with Paramount Pictures, New Line, and Crystal Lake Entertainment over the rights. Paramount gave them the rights to use anything from their films, including the title, which New Line had been unable to do since they'd attained the rights to the Jason Voorhees character back in the 90s. The deal was that Paramount would distribute the film internationally, while New Line would distribute in the United States. And despite the fact that many, myself included, considered this to be just another entry in the series, producers Andrew Form and Brad Fuller were adamant from the onset that this was not the 12th entry in the series. Instead, they simply reworked elements from the first 4 films into their own preferred mythology. They wanted this not to serve as an origin for the character, but explain things such as where Jason got his mask and why he's able to operate so freely. And despite the term remake being bandied about, including in our title, they had no interest in returning to the exploits of Pamela Voorhees. Plenty of ideas were formulated in pre-production that never made it to the final product, the most intriguing of which being the inclusion of the Tommy Jarvis character. Elements of his character would be pushed onto others with the hopes of potentially including him in the future. Another element that they needed to contend with was whether or not Jason would be supernatural. After part 3, Jason really entered zombie mode and got away from his more man-in-the-woods origins. The producers still wanted him grounded in reality, so they did away with any of the supernatural stuff. But that meant that they needed to explain just how Jason was able to get around the camp so quickly. Their solution: he would use underground tunnels in order to traverse the camp quickly. And this idea was actually the first contribution from director Marcus Nispel. See, Nispel had been brought aboard after successfully helming the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. But he wasn't the first choice, as Jonathan Liebsman was actually first announced as the director of the film. Unfortunately, he ended up having scheduling conflicts and had to drop out. Given Nispel's unique eye and having already directed one successful reboot, it made sense to have him helm the project. It also made sense for Freddy vs. Jason scribes Mark Swift and Damian Shannon to write the screenplay, as they'd already had extensive knowledge of the character. But they made some rules for writing a Friday the 13th. Number 1. No meta dialogue. They wanted to avoid their characters being self-referential. This didn't exist in the early films, so they wanted to go back to a more natural way of speaking. Along with this, they didn't want any of the kids saying Jason's name.
He said the cops came, they were looking for that Jason guy.
I guess this is a battle that they ultimately lost. Number 2. Territorial Jason. No more lumbering. They wanted a Jason who was quick, loose, and was living off the land. He would be killing people who trespassed, and there would be a hunter's edge to him. They wanted less randomness with the kills, so they felt this reasoning gave him motivation. Number 3. Avoid origin. They did not want to dive into Jason's childhood and explain anything that happened during that time. There was a worry about demystifying the character. There's a black and white sequence which essentially shows a recreation of Alice cutting off Pamela Voorhees' head. It's a great way of showing why Jason does what he does without going full-blown origin story. When it came to the casting of Jason Voorhees himself, there was one person that was suggested by makeup artist Scott Stoddard as being perfect for the role: stuntman and actor Derek Mears. Jason had long been a dream role for Mears, so he started training as soon as rumblings of the movie even began. Mears felt that he had a deep connection with Jason, having grown up with alopecia and being bullied for it as a kid. He wanted to portray Jason as someone who's been bullied and is finally getting payback. It's an interesting angle and manages to make Jason a bit more sympathetic than he's been in the past. The rest proved difficult to cast, as they needed 13 different actors who all needed varied degrees of chemistry. So they would do many different combinations and recastings until they finally got it right. The final cast would include Jared Padalecki, Danielle Panabaker, Travis Van Winkle, Ryan Hansen, Aaron Yu, Arlen Escarpeta, Willa Ford, and Juliana Gill. The sheriff character, played by Richard Burgi, wasn't actually cast until just 12 hours before his scenes were to be filmed. Talk about cutting it close. Shooting would take place in Austin, Texas, and give it a slightly different look from the primarily New Jersey and California shot series. There was a lot of tension between Nispel and the producers during filming, often vying for creative control. Nispel would often get frustrated with the constant rewrites that were coming in. He just wanted to make a movie. In terms of the story, Shannon and Swift concocted the pretty genius idea of following two distinct groups of people. The first group of young adults is heading out on a camping trip in the woods. There are some nefarious reasons for them being there, but most importantly, they trespass on old Jason's territory, and he does not like that. Not one bit. So he murders all of them one by one, even seemingly taking out young Whitney. When we're introduced to our second group of friends, it's clear they're a little bougier. They stay at a beautiful cabin. Hell, this is a full-blown house that these rich effects just used once in a while. And we've also got Whitney's brother Clay trying to find his sister. Jason slices and dices them, and we get to see some of his smarts, setting up traps and showing more cunning than we've seen from him in the past. They even do the stereotypical jump scare ending with Jason jumping out of the lake one last time. And since YouTube is being really stingy with the sex stuff, I'll just say that Juliana Gill provides us some of the best nudity of the entire franchise in a scene that, had this movie been released in the 80s, would have worn out many VHS tapes. There was another nude scene in the film that ended up causing quite the issue during filming, as actress Moran Achis was originally cast as Amanda. Anyone who's watched the movie knows that this is a role that requires quite a lot of nudity, and it was written in the script as such, as filmmakers really wanted to return to the boobage of the 80s, so it's not like this was sprung on her. Still, the actress was uncomfortable and left the role, leaving actress America Olivo to absolutely blow audiences away. While most of Friday the 13th's 13 kills consist of practical effects, there was still a number of visual effects used throughout the movie. Asylum Visual Effects worked on 25 shots in the film, mostly enhancing CGI, but also doing clever things like blending the shot of a real campfire with the hanging sleeping bag above it. This isn't the only time they used this trick, with Willa Ford reacting to an imaginary boat, only for the shot to be digitally combined with one of a real boat. It's a beautiful blend of practical with computer-generated effects. Chelsea's death was originally conceived as a more psychological kill, with Jason standing at shore, not letting her return to the land. She would eventually exhaust and drown, but they wanted a more violent ending to her, so they changed it to the more brutal one that we get in the film. While the producers did attain the rights to Harry Manfredini's classic score, we'd never hear it in its original entirety. Instead, composer Steve Jablonsky would utilize the classic and ma-ma-mas into his own style. Friday the 13th released in the United States on February 13th, 2009, and brought in over $40 million on its opening weekend. The film would end its run at $92 million, giving us the highest non-crossover gross of the franchise. Unfortunately, the movie was not well received, earning a measly 25% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. This probably had some effect on any potential sequel that we would receive, as I can't imagine anyone being upset about those box office numbers. It should also be said that while this does come from Platinum Dunes, and Michael Bay's name is often the one brought up when it comes to that production company, Bay was deep into the Transformers series at this point. It was actually Fuller and Form who were on set day to day, so they're really the ones who should be getting your praise, or your ire. Friday the 13th provides a movie that breaks down some of the best elements from the first 4 films, and utilizes them in one big mishmash. Jason is back to being scary, with his calculated approach to killing and fantastic design. Derek Mears really cements himself amongst the best Jason performers out there. Last we heard, the Friday the 13th franchise will be brought to television via a prequel series titled Crystal Lake. With A24 producing, and given their impressive, albeit weird track record, it's sure to be a unique approach. Regardless, we'll hopefully see a new Friday the 13th movie soon, because 14 years is way too long to go without watching our favorite hockey mask-wearing psychopath go on a murder spree. It's the little things in life that keep us going. Happy Friday the 13th!